Okay, good morning. So a round of applause for everybody who's up to come to this session. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming the last day of the session. There's one more after this, so you're not the all-time winners, but you're pretty good for being up at least this time of day. So thank you very much. My name is Beth Mace. I'm the chief economist and the director of the outreach group at NIC. This is my colleague, Lana Peck. And the two of us this morning are going to talk to you about location and how location matters and how it makes a winner and a loser across markets. And the exciting thing is that NIC, we've had a time series of data now for 140 markets across the US from the beginning of 2006 till today. So we keep enhancing that data and slicing and dicing and segmenting it in different ways. So this session is going to be all about that. How you can look at the data, how you can use the data to make market decisions, and how you can use the data to make forward-looking market decisions, as well as if you have assets under management, how you can look at it to try to ascertain what's going on in your property versus other properties. Following this, the next session, I'm also speaking at, if you want a double dose, and that's going to be an entirely different session. So you don't have to worry that if you're here, you can't go to that one. That's going to be my more traditional blue book, which is a macroeconomic outlook, followed by a little bit about what's going on in individual markets, what's going on in the Federal Reserve policy, and stuff like that. So I'm an economist by background, so that's where my real passion is. But I also really love the NIC map data, so I'm also passionate about this. So just as a reminder, you all have a mobile app. If you go to the home page, experience survey, session evaluations, that is actually something that's really used by NIC, the planning committees that put the agenda together for today and for the fall conference. We pay close attention to the results of your feedback on these sessions. And if you like it, then we do more like it. And if you don't like it, then we don't repeat it. So please respond if you can to that. There's a lot of me. Okay. So today's presentation, I'm going to start with a top-down view of what's going on in terms of the seniors housing market broadly. Then I'm going to bring it from bottom up and show you how local markets, some of the parts do in fact add up to the total. Demographics, I know we always talk about demographics, and I keep trying to find different ways to show you different things about the demographics. So today I have an age pyramid to show you, which is a moving one, so it's interactive, so that will be a little fun. Then I'm going to talk about a big study that NIC has been working on for the last few years called the middle market, the forgotten middle. And I'll get more into that detail shortly. And then we're going to do the deep dive. And again, we're going to show you ways to slice the dice and data for 14,000 properties that we're tracking across the US in 140 markets. And we're going to be able to look at it on various dimensions, specifically looking at it from a penetration rate point of view, and how penetration rates do or do not correlate with occupancy rates. Labor market conditions. Rate tier analysis. This is a brand new product that NIC has just produced last week. Slicing the data that we have by rate tier, so highest rate quartile, lowest quartile, and middle quartiles. County level analysis, and then walkability scores, which we just started to produce for various properties across the US. So stay tuned. All right. So big picture. This is looking at the occupancy rate for the largest 31 markets in the US, annual data from 2006 to 2018. And there's a lot of interesting takeaways on this chart. First off, this green line here is the occupancy rate. The occupancy rate here that you see is 88%. And that's been falling, you can see, for the last 4 years. And it's not at an all-time low, but pretty close to an all-time low. If I did this chart just for assisted living, as opposed to assisted and independent, which this is, the assisted living occupancy rate would be at an all-time low, because there's been more development activity in assisted living than in independent living. The blue bars here represent inventory growth, and the red bars represent net demand or absorption. And notice that the blue bars have exceeded the red bars for the last 4 years. So there's been more inventory growth than there has been the ability to absorb that in terms of demand. But also notice that the height of the red bar here is as high as it's ever been. So one takeaway for you is that demand has been strong, strongest ever, but it simply has been strong enough to absorb all that new inventory that's come into the market. And that pattern varies a lot by local markets, which I'll show you in a minute. The other thing to notice is that the occupancy rate back in the beginning of the time series that we tracked it was over 90%. And then it fell to a low point of about 87.2% during the recession, and then gradually has come up. But notice the blue bars here, the inventory growth. What happened during the recession is that there was a lot of capital that was in the market, so there was a lot of development that occurred just at the worst time because the national economy was weakening. So that caused the inventory to exceed by significant amounts. You can look at the difference between that. And that caused that drop in occupancy. Then capital pretty much dried up. There was very limited capital, and that reflected in this inventory growth, what you see was quite weak. Capital started to reemerge again in the 2014 and 2015 period, and that allowed development to happen. So development is capital is a necessary component to have any kind of development. And at this session that we're here this week, there's a lot of capital providers here, and there's excess capital. There's more money chasing the deals than there are the need for it right now. So as a result of that, you see the market's pretty competitive. There's a lot of capital from institutional investors, private equity groups, pension funds, public REITs, and a lot of money from banks, large banks, small banks, and a lot of equity funds are actually developing debt funds right now. So now let's drill down to local markets. So as I told you, I'm an economist by background, so I have to give you a little bit of economics here. I'm a regional economist. So factors that affect local market performance. So the broad trends that we see in the macroeconomy, like interest rates, consumer confidence, housing activity, those are more macro, and that's going to be my next session, if you want to come to that. But this is looking at really what the drivers of sort of local markets are. So certainly economic vitality. And how do you define economic vitality? Well, largely it's a result of the industry mix in an area. So you're going to see an area in the US, we'll say, like, take a San Jose, which is tech-oriented. Tech is pretty hot right now. So that's the engine for that economy in terms of its growth. If you go through another industry mix, we'll say manufacturing tends to be a slower growing sector. So if your economy is based on the manufacturing, your fundamentals are going to be weaker in that market. So often when you look at markets, if you're on the acquisition side of the world and you're looking to pick up markets, it's not just what's going on in the seniors housing market, but you really need to look at what the overall drivers are for that broader economy in terms of the industry mix, because that's one of the key factors to grow it. The cost of doing business, or the cost of living, is also a critical component. Can your labor market survive there in terms of the costs? You hear that as a criticism in the Northeast a lot, that it's so expensive, or on the West Coast, that it's so expensive that people can't afford to be there. For seniors housing, this is a big issue because we're having a hard time getting the labor to service all of our properties. And some of that you hear stories constantly that the labor that you need can't afford to live in the market in which your properties are located. Local infrastructure, tax laws, climate, natural environment. Increasingly, we're seeing that that's an important decision for where businesses locate, is the climate change that we're seeing, and that's having impact on the overall ability to grow your business. Now, broadly for seniors housing, these are other factors that you should consider when you're looking at a market. One would be a barrier to entry. So a barrier to entry could be a physical barrier to entry. It could be a mountain. In Florida, it could be the Everglades, not the Evergreens, Everglades. It could be the ocean. In seniors housing, you often see that it's also a physical barrier like a highway. I live in the Boston area, and in the Boston area, there's a lot of difference between one town to the next. And you won't go, if you live in Wellesley, you wouldn't go to Natick, something like that. And so that's a physical barrier, even though it's more of a psychological barrier, but it also is a barrier. There are a lot of regulatory barriers. You can see that a lot. California, difficult to develop, very difficult to develop. 4, 5, 6 years often to get a piece of land entitled to be able to develop it for seniors housing. I was in Dallas last week, and there was a speaker that was talking about that you can get the entitlement in a month, and he was complaining that it might take 6 months. I was like, well, you don't know anything. You got to go to California where it's like 5 or 6 years. So that's an important factor, and that leads into the amount of inventory and the amount of development that goes on in any given geography. Another factor affecting local area performance in terms of seniors housing would be the existing competition in recent development. And that's the story that we've been hearing a lot of for the last 3 or 4 years, is the supply that's coming into the markets. And I'm going to show you that supply is not coming into all the markets at the same pace. Home values and home price appreciation, that's an important consideration because a lot of seniors use the equity from their home to determine where and when they can actually move out of their home to be able to use those proceeds from that towards seniors housing. Demographic demand. So I think everyone in this room probably understands this, but this was new when I first started underwriting seniors housing, which is a number of years ago, that adult children have a keen influence. We used to just look at the number of seniors that were in the market, but the adult children who are often at least the influencers of those decisions also have a big impact. And you see a lot of operators now market specifically to the adult children in an area to draw them into a market. And this is new, the last bullet point, demographic drivers of labor supply. Increasingly, you see feasibility analysts really look at the labor availability in a market. And I know a number of operators and developers that have walked away from a market because they look around and they don't think they have their sufficient labor supply there. That's increasingly a drag, and it's going to, in my view, continue to be a drag in terms of overall development opportunities. So those are the sort of the background that's affecting the performance of markets that you can see on this slide. So many of you probably are familiar with this. Actually, can you raise your hand here if you're a Nick Map subscriber? Good for you. And those who aren't, you want to be, because you can get this data. But so those who are Nick Map subscribers know this data, but let me explain it for those who don't. So this is looking at the occupancy rate for 31 geographies, which we call our primary markets. And the length of this bar here is looking at the all-time low and the all-time high of that occupancy rate in a market. So for example, here's San Jose, that I talk about a lot. And you can see that the lowest that the occupancy rate ever was in San Jose was about 88%, and the highest was about 96%. The dots show where we were a year ago and where we are today. So a year ago, we were almost at 95%, and we're almost at 95% today. So very little change in that market. Now go to the other end, and this is HOU for Houston. And Houston, that blue dot is over here. That's the current occupancy rate. That would be 80.9%, an all-time low. And that's way below where it was a year ago. Cleveland, all-time low occupancy rate. So a lot of variation in these markets in terms of their performance. There's a 14 percentage point difference between the most occupied market in the US and the least occupied. I used to underwrite other property types as well. 14 percentage point difference between the best and the worst is really wide. So I caution when people make one broad statement about what's going on in seniors housing. It's local, it's real estate, it's local, and there's a lot of variation from one metro area to the next. So it really forces you to drill down, which is what we're going to be showing you today, is how to drill down further. Another takeaway on this would be, Lana's going to be talking a lot about Denver. And Denver is right here. So Denver's occupancy rate today is is below where it was a year ago. And it's about, it's about 86 or 87%. The other thing to notice is the length of these bars. Some of them are quite short. Here's New York, really short. And then over here you get San Antonio, quite wide. And that's an important consideration, too, in looking at a market, because a market like New York is going to be a more stable market, not nearly as volatile. So if you're underwriting a market like San Antonio, we'll say, you have less certainty over what the future is in terms of the occupancy rate, because you've seen that wide variation in occupancy. Whereas New York, you'd be pretty good to underwrite in a pretty narrow bandwidth because it hasn't seen much variation over time. So those occupancy rates are a function of both demand and supply. So this chart tries to show that. On this line over here is inventory growth. And it ranges from negative to almost 25%. And this is looking at the last 3 years for the amount of inventory that's been developed in individual markets across the US. The top, This big red circle up here is Atlanta. So Atlanta in the last 3 years has seen its inventory grow by almost 25%. That's a lot. It's significantly more than what we've seen at the national level. And in fact, if you look at the size of those big red circles, there's 6 of them that account for about 17 to 20% of the overall inventory growth in the last 3 years. That would be Atlanta up here. Then we have San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, and Kansas City. They've all seen their inventory grow almost by 20%. So you're going to see a lot of stress in those markets in terms of occupancy unless the demand has been able to meet that. So that's what the colors on this circle show. The red signifies that the occupancy rate has significantly declined or deteriorated. And there are some that are green where we have actually seen an improvement in occupancy. But let me explain the other piece of this chart, which is the demand. So when I say demand here, that's a way that we measure demand is by looking at the change in occupied stock. In the real estate world, it's called absorption. And we've seen some markets also see significant growth in absorption, 16 to 20%. So while Atlanta had 24% increase in its inventory, the demand was about 20% in the last 3 years. So it was strong, but again, it wasn't strong enough to absorb all that new inventory that came in the market. And as a result, the occupancy went down. Now, just to show you a green circle, so the green would mean that the occupancy has actually increased, we have New York City sitting over here. So New York City has seen absorption of about 8 or 9%, beating the inventory growth. So New York, as we all know, has a lot of barriers to entry. It's difficult to develop in. And as a result, the demand has been able to exceed the supply in that market. Now, that said, this isn't a secret, and we're starting to see a lot of development, a fair amount of development going on in New York. There's currently 3,200 units under construction, which in the scheme of New York isn't very much, but in the scheme of the inventory, it's a lot. Yeah, Alice?
Is that New York City data, or is it the New York?
It's the metropolitan area. Okay. So it's the boroughs and everything. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So at this point, any other questions up to what we've just talked about? Okay. Yes?
So that's Pittsburgh there on the far left?
Yep.
So what is that? How would you interpret that?
So Pittsburgh, there has been very little inventory growth. In this case, maybe a little bit of inventory has been given back. Maybe that could be due to change from shifting something from independent living to assisted living. But the occupancy rate is quite strong at 91.4%. So it's a market that's sort of stable. Demand and supply have met each other. Any other questions? Okay. Yep.
Could you say a word about the boom and bust cycle? Because it looks like the inventory growth was the same lane that we were in on the bus before, and it looks like we may be approaching something like that now.
Yes. So if you look at this pattern, there definitely is a development cycle that's gone on here. And there is concern that there could be a bust. And there's a lot of capital that's on the sidelines, in fact, now waiting for distressed deals to come to the market in certain markets. So that would be perhaps a San Antonio or perhaps a Houston market, where you've seen those Houston, I just showed you the occupancy rate is like 80%. So there would be a number of operators that could be in distress there, because if they developed, they probably assumed 3 years ago or 2 years ago when they developed that they'd have an occupancy rate of 90% or 95% to make their underwriting, meet their underwriting standards. It's 80%. So they can only stand that stress for so long, so that there will be a bust in some markets, or at least in certain submarkets of some markets. But not in all, as I showed, because there are some markets that we see on this side, Baltimore, San Jose, Portland, San Diego, Sacramento, that are doing quite well. So again, I don't think you can do a broad brush against how all the markets are doing. Any other questions? Okay. So this is a chart in the description for this session. We said we were going to look at rent growth and occupancy. So I did that, but I'm not very satisfied with this chart, so we're going to do it again another time and bring it back. But let me explain what it's showing. You tend to think that a market that has the highest occupancy rate would in fact have the highest rent growth. And that is the case for these markets up here. Here's San Jose, SJ, Portland, Oregon, POR. And so it works pretty well up here. And over here it works pretty well that Dallas, which is one of the least occupied markets, has in fact seen some of the weakest rent growth. But this is a one point in time, so it's looking at the fourth quarter of 18 data. And I've gone back and I've looked. So Houston, I just showed it had the lowest occupancy rate, but it also has rent growth that's about 4%. So you go, doesn't work, right? So I think the better way to do this, and we'll do it next time, is to go back and look at like a 2-year average and to see what the trends are. Because when I did that manually and I went back and I saw it, in fact, Houston doesn't really have that 4% rent growth. It's on average significantly less than that. So it was a one point in time sort of aberration. So the idea was good here, but we need to do more work on it. So not too many takeaways on that one. That said, this chart is amazing. It's gonna. So this is a heat map. It shows the geographies over here alphabetically from Atlanta down to Washington, D.C. And it shows construction as a share of inventory. And if you do nothing else, what you can see is that there are real development cycles that occur over time by geography. So it starts here in, up here you can see 2006 and goes through 2018. So let's follow Atlanta. So Atlanta, we know, if you follow it from other real estate asset types, or if you just watch the economy, that has real boom and bust characteristics, Jack, that you were asking about. So if you look at this, blue, and then it goes red, so a lot of construction, blue, 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 and then red, 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 rarely red. There are other markets, we'll take Baltimore, that tend to be mostly blue. So more constrained construction activity. And if you look at where construction is hot today, which would be over here, the red markets would be Atlanta, Denver, which is a market that Lana's going to be talking more about, Phoenix down here, Riverside, and Sacramento. But again, it's really interesting because you can see that there are real development cycles over different geographies. Now, here's San Antonio, which was blue, 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 and then red, 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 and then blue. So we were talking about it before. San Antonio, we've been talking about for a long time, is a market that has had way too much development. At one point, San Antonio, 25% of its inventory was under construction. That's a lot, 25%. I've been beating it up for how long? Like 3 years? And I'm here to tell you there's zero development going on in San Antonio right now. So what we've seen is we've just been able to see the occupancy rate gradually come up. If you go back to this last chart, oops, this one. Here's San Antonio. So a year ago it was at its lowest, and now it's at least still low, but at least it's improved. So one of the hopes when Nick created this Nick Map data series, which now goes back, as I said, to 2006, was that we'd have more information and we'd be more informed about what's going on in individual markets, and it might at least keep operators and lenders and equity providers better informed to be able to know when to go in, when to turn the spigot on, when to turn the spigot off. So it does seem that some of that message is getting out, because otherwise we didn't, 20 years ago, we didn't have that kind of information to know. So again, part of the session today is to show you all this kind of new data that we have out there to help make informed decisions. Okay. So demographics. What's hype? What's real? There's a lot of talk about, oh, we've turned the corner, tons of demand coming in, and then others that say, no, 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 it's many years away. So let's see what's going on. So this is this cool chart. It's interactive. It's from the Census Bureau and the World Bank. You can all access it. And what it's showing is the size of the bars on either side are showing you different age cohorts as time goes on. So on the top here, 2038, 2039, 2040, 41, 42. So watch how this big blue piece, which is the baby boomers, so watch this now, so 2014. Watch how this group, which is the baby boomers, by 22, 23, are moving up. And watch how the shape of this has gone from like a pyramid to more of a rectangle. And this has significant bearing because in the early period, the old, which is the top of this pyramid, there's very few of those old people. As time goes on, as the baby boomers age, that, quote, old cohort is getting bigger and bigger. But the problem is, among the problems, the challenges, is that when it's narrow at the top, when it's more like a pyramid, there's a lot of working age population to take care of the limited number of older people that are out there. As the baby boomers age, you'll notice that baby boomers didn't have as many children, so there's not as many children to take care of those older people. So as a result, you see ratios like what we call the dependency ratio shifting dramatically, or you see the adult children to seniors shifting dramatically. So this year, there are 7 adult children, defined as those who are 45 to 64, for everybody who's over 80. By 2030, that shifts to 4 to 1. And by 2050, it shifts to 3 to 1. So it's changing, and we have to pay attention to that because the system can't handle it. There's just too many older people to be taken care of. So that's what a lot of the demographics that you hear about are talking about. Yep, a lot of countries face that. Japan absolutely is ahead of us. So there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from Japan. Europe is pretty similar to us in terms of our demographics. Canada is pretty similar. If you want to see something really interesting, if you look at Africa, completely opposite because there are so few adults that are alive, so that their pyramid is the opposite of what we just showed. Japan has had, I think they're still figuring it out, but I think that they've done a few things. They've changed the narrative about what it is to get older, and they have the old taking care of the older, and the older taking care of the oldest. They've changed what it means to retire. So when you retire, you give back that same narrative. You're starting to hear it in this country. They've got a lot of robots that they're using. They're heavily invested in robotics in terms of companionship, in terms of ability to move people. If you want to find something really interesting, Google Japan robots and elderly. And you're going to see these really neat things that they're doing. So there's a robot that you can see can literally come up, pick up somebody from their bed, put them in the chair, move them to the dining table, can talk to that person. So there's lots of really interesting technology that's being used, but a lot of it is in the robotics area. Yeah.
Has Nick ever done any algorithms or analysis on the possibility that the seniors would be living longer, and what that means to the numbers that you share?
Yep. So these numbers that I'm sharing are from the census. So these are their estimates. So it takes into account longevity. So for example, I don't have the slide in here, but we know that in 1900, if you were born in 1900, you were likely to live to you're 47 years old. If you're born in the year 2000, you were likely to live to you're 77. So in 100 years of time, people gained 30 years. That's pretty remarkable, right? So that's the lifespan and life expectancy. Unfortunately, that was on this huge trajectory up. It's no longer. It's starting to come down because of the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis. So many people are dying from drugs that it's starting to tick down right now. So this chart is looking at, take that age pyramid, but now I took it and I looked at the individual data points from it. And one of the ways we've been looking at the seniors are looking at what I call the young old, the middle old, and the old old. So this is on the left is the green, which is what I call the young old. So those are 75 to 82. The middle old, 83 to 87, and the older old, which is 88 plus. So you can look at this and decide for yourself where you think your client base is. Are they the young old, the middle old, or the old old? The demographics are clearly favoring the young old right now, and that's because the baby boomers are just starting to enter into these cohorts. And we see for the 75 to 82 that in 2018 there were 13 million people that were that age. By 2025, it's 18.4. So that's a 5 million person increase in those number of years. These other cohorts don't grow until later on. Between 2018 and 2025, we see about a 1.1 million increase for that middle old. And then the old go up by 400,000. And then as time goes on, you can see how those growth trajectories pursue. So if you're really banking on a real acceleration in sort of the middle old, for right now, you're not going to see those numbers generally. You might in various geographies across the U.S., but in general, you're not going to see that. And that's evident in this chart too. Same concept. The growth rates here are strongest for the 75 to 82 in 2022. And then for the 83 to 87, we don't see the strongest growth there until, which is 9%, until about 2030. So it's still a long ways to go. So as we look forward, we go out to today and then we go out to 2029, we've been focusing on at NIC a study that we're calling the Forgotten Middle. And what we're trying to do is look at and size the middle income seniors today and in the year 2029. So we're trying to figure out, first of all, we have to define what do we mean by middle income. So I can't give you any of the results of the study yet. I'm just going to tease you today. Because we're working with a group in Washington, a policy group called Health Affairs, which worked on a manuscript. We're having an event in Washington in April where we're going to show the big results. But I'm going to tease you with it today. And this is going to be a theme for NIC for the next several years. So we're going to be hearing more about that. More of the results of the study will be being filtered out to you to give you a sense of the opportunity that we really believe exists for investing in housing for middle-income seniors. So the study is a demand study. We're initially just sizing the cohort. So we're going to say, for example, that there's 100 people that are in this cohort, we'll say. We're going to tell you what their demographic characteristics are. What do they look like? Not physically, but in terms of their income characteristics, racial characteristics, educational characteristics. And then on top of that, we're going to layer what their care needs are. So this is one of the first studies that we think has combined housing needs with care needs. So we're going to be able to look at this cohort and say, this is the number of people that we think are going to have chronic conditions. This is the number of that same group, this is the number that we think are going to have mobility limitations. So for seniors housing, mobility limitations are really important because that's often the situation that forces someone to move from the home into more of an assisted living type setting. In addition to that, we're going to be looking at cognitive impairment. The idea is to try to allow investors and operators and developers to have a better handle on what the demand is going to be for these individual groups. We know, for the most part, that the highest income cohort can probably afford today's seniors housing market in terms of the prices. And we know that the lowest income cohorts probably have some type of government support to help them. But there's this big middle group that has to be served that we've been hearing about for a long time doesn't have sufficient savings. So the thesis from NIC's point of view is that government alone can't take care of this big cohort. The private sector has to step in. So we want to bring attention to it. That's what NIC is, a capital-facing organization. We've brought capital in, private capital in for senior housing as the industry that we know today. But we need to now take that and bring it into the middle income. As a society, I showed you the demographics. A big portion of that group that's aging, those baby boomers, are going to need housing and care options. So our hope is that that's going to be the case, that this study will start the discussion. So we're working on two elements of this. One is a policy focus, where we're talking and we're bringing this up to into Capitol Hill in DC in April, to try to draw attention of legislators to this important issue. Second, we're bringing it into New York for an investor summit similar to one that we did about 10 years ago to try to demonstrate to investors and debt providers the opportunity that exists here. We're going to be talking about the investment return potential. We're going to be talking about how do you actually make it a more affordable product? How do you figure out a product that has a lower rent threshold? So as I said, it's not a solution study at this point. It's a demand study. Our hope is to get the discussion going. Yep.
When is that going to be at New York conference?
That's going to be in May 21st. At this point, it's limited to a limited number of individuals right now. If you have strong interest, you can come. We have a wait list on it right now. You can give me your information, and we'll try. I know your information, but you can give me a card to remind me, and we'll try to add you to a list. So, but we're pretty excited about it. Bob Kramer's in the back. Bob, you want to take 2 minutes to say anything?
No, obviously for NIC
So very exciting. You're going to be hearing about it a lot at the fall conference, the next spring conference, the one after that, the one after that. So it's going to be another thesis that you're going to be hearing more and more about. Okay, labor markets. Briefly, as we all know, the job market is really hot. You're all seeing charts on total employment. We created 2.6 million jobs in the U.S. economy last year. Another way to look at the job market, so I want to bring out to you, because you may not have seen this, is something called the JOLTS data, J-O-L-T-S data. It's job openings, quits, and hirings numbers. It's from BLS. And it's just another way to gauge how tight the labor market is, in fact. So the blue line here is looking at the number of job openings. So as of, this was December, there were 6.9 million jobs that were open in the U.S. Not a record, but almost a record high. That's the blue line right here. The gray line here is looking at the number of hirings. 5.7 million were hired in that same period. But notice how they switch. The blue line here is job openings, has been ahead of hirings. Back in this, it was the opposite. So what this is showing us is that there's a lot of jobs out there that aren't being filled. And that speaks to this sort of skill mismatch that we have, or the geographic mismatch that we have, that you might be unemployed and looking for a job in Seattle, but the job might be in the Boston area. Or maybe we need high-tech jobs, but all we have are labor positions, that kind of thing. So there's a big mismatch going on in the jobs. Secondly, the quit ratio. That looks at the number of people that are actually quitting. And not at an all-time high, but pretty close to an all-time high of about 3.4 million. That speaks to the confidence people have, because you're not going to quit your job unless you know there's another job to go to. So again, just another, you might hear about it, so I wanted to share that with you as another indicator of the job market. This is the one we're more traditionally used to looking at, which is the unemployment rate. In the fourth quarter, the unemployment rate, 3.9% on average. I just point out that this data starts in 1948. We've only had 3 periods where the unemployment rate has been lower. So the job market is really, really tight. And when I don't have the slides in here to show that, next session we'll have those slides. But it's putting pressure, significant upward pressure on wage rates, which is putting upward pressure on expense loads for a lot of operators. And we'll talk more about that in the next session. And there are some markets that are even tighter. So here's Boston, where I'm from, 2.4% unemployment rate. San Francisco, 2.5%. And then there are some, like Stockton, which is more of an ag manufacturing-based economy, with about 6.1%. But these are all low, regardless of where you are. Question?
Now, I was just going to ask if your numbers include people retiring, the baby boomers are getting ready to retire, so I'm just wondering if that's part of your chart.
Well, it would be anybody that's considered in the labor force. Yeah. So yes, if you were not retired, you'd still be in this number. If you'd retired, that would mean that you'd be taken out of the labor force, so you would not be in this data. So because this is an important issue, NIC has been working with using data from BLS. I see Dan Rainey, my colleague here. He's worked really hard on this data set. This is looking at, 4 or 5 different BLS reports that we've compiled together at NIC to allow you to actually look at how wages compare by geography, by occupation. And this first chart shows that. Do you have a question?
Yeah, can you go back 2 slides? I want to see what's so these are below 3%.
Correct.
Seattle is
Seattle is not on this chart, but Seattle probably is less than 3. I'd have to look it up, but Seattle would be a really tight labor market too. This is really easy data to get. Just Google BLS metro area unemployment rates, and you'll get reams and reams of data on it. So again, this is data. It's recently been updated as of May of 2017. Thank you, Dan. And what it shows is in this case, looking at the national mean wage. This is for nursing assistants. So this is by occupation. You can do it by many, many different occupations. This is just illustrative. And it shows that the mean wage in the U.S. for a nursing assistant was about $28,000. That's the gray line. The red line is the California average wage rate for a nursing assistant, significantly higher than that, about $34,000. So 28 versus 34. And then it shows, because we can do this by geography within California, there's San Francisco at about $45,000. So why this is important is if you have a property that's your operating in San Francisco and it has CNAs, you're going to have a much higher expense load in San Francisco than you would if you were national. And then it also shows, if you're in Merced, California, you're going to be closer to where you are nationally in terms of that wage rate. So if I have a portfolio of properties, it's important for me to understand the wage rates of how they compare by one geography to the next and across different kind of occupations. And then the last bit of this chart shows comparative labor market conditions by industry, so what they call a NAIC code, North American Industrial Classification Code, but you don't care. So NAIC codes, so you can look to see what a nursing assistant in California gets if they work for a skilled nursing property or a CCRC or just more broadly. And this was pretty interesting. It showed that a nursing assistant for a CCRC gets paid slightly less than does that same nursing assistant for a skilled nursing and does that same nursing assistant if they're not in either of those industry sectors. So it takes time for you to do your own analysis on this, but it is pretty helpful in order to take a look at things. All right, I want to be mindful of time, so I'm kind of chatting it up here. Okay, penetration rates. So penetration rates, by definition, according to NIC, is the number of seniors housing units, or the inventory, divided by the number of households over 75 years of age. So households, so you can define a penetration rate pretty much however you want. You just want to be consistent. So sometimes you see a penetration rate defined as divided by individuals. We're doing it by households over 75. Sometimes you see people income qualify it. It doesn't matter, I'm just normalizing it to give you a sense. So a penetration rate, for perspective, by our definition, for seniors housing, 10.8% penetration rate across the US. Highest markets, Portland, Oregon. So these are the markets that have the highest concentration of seniors housing relative to the population base. Highest is Portland, Oregon, at about 22%, twice that of the US, national. Followed by Minneapolis, 22%, Seattle, 18%, and then at the way end of the curve is New York. So how does that happen? Well, it has to do with these factors. It could have to do with the population or the household growth has been really fast, so that could affect your penetration rate. Growth in inventory, if you've had a lot of growth in inventory, by definition, you're going to have a higher penetration rate if that hasn't been offset by a lot of new demand. Cultural influences, operator reputation, just sheer familiarity with a product. How long has that product been in the market? So we've spent some time on this trying to really figure out what determines penetration rates. We're still working on it. It's not very black and white. I think a lot of it has to do with things that aren't measurable. Like we think there's a lot of cultural influences here. Or if people are really familiar with it. In some areas, like in Minneapolis, it's pretty common. It's a stage of life. You retire, you do this, and then you move into like a senior housing property. In New York City, which has the lowest penetration rate, that's not as common. So one of the things we wanted to look at was the relationship of penetration rates to occupancy to see, in fact, did they relate. So on the left side here are penetration rates. So the highest penetration rates are down here. So as I said, that would be Portland, Minneapolis, Philly, Seattle. And on this side, these would be markets that have low penetration rates. There's New York. And then occupancy over here. So highest occupied markets would be San Jose, there it is. And lowest would be markets over here, Dallas, San Antonio, that we've already talked about. Now, if there was a lot of correlation between these occupancies and penetration, you'd see a lot of markets along that line right there, and we don't. So it's curious, and we don't have an answer, and we're happy to take suggestions on why that is the case, that they don't necessarily correlate. That's for independent living. Same story here for assisted living. You guys have these slides, you can look at it, and I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to move along. But then we also look to see how those penetration rates changed over time. And this is looking at data between 2000 and...
Could you go back to that? I was thinking about Philadelphia. The Delaware Valley has a senior housing culture
Yep.
and has for a long time. And the occupancy's down, the inventory is aging, so it becomes sort of, is it a overbuilt, because there the culture clearly favors senior housing more than anywhere else.
So I don't know the data for Philly off the top of my head, to be honest with you. Right. But it absolutely totally agree with you that it, culturally, in that whole area that you're talking about, it does have a high concentration and very familiar product. It's been there. It does have one of the higher penetration rates in the country. So how does it change over time? So this was a little surprising, to be honest, when we looked at it, that my colleague Ann, raise your hand, she's back there. She worked on a lot of this with me. That we can see that there was change in time over penetration rates. So Minneapolis saw a significant increase in penetration rates for assisted living, whereas Atlanta saw a decline in penetration rates. So again, what are the factors? What could have to do with inventory growth? It could have to do with maybe a saturation in the market. So it's analysis that we're working on, but we wanted to share it with you just to get everybody thinking about this, because it's a pretty interesting little topic. So I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Lana, here. But before I do that, I thought, if you're NIC staff, can you just stand up so people can recognize and see who you are? There's a lot of NIC staff in here. So I get to talk about the data, but these are all the people that are really doing all the work behind the scenes. Okay, Lana.
Thanks, Beth. Good morning, everyone. All right. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about market segmentation. Here we go. We're going to peel back the layers. Beth just gave us a very thorough overview of the macroeconomic conditions, the factors affecting local market performance, and the economic drivers, the demographic drivers of demand, labor supply issues, development cycles by market. The next step is to really just funnel down the data even further into a few different ways to segment markets. So in doing so, my objectives are going to be to leave you with a greater understanding that NICMAP offers several tools to drill deeper into market level metrics, including new tools for market segmentation, to target markets more effectively and position properties within a portfolio or a competitive set based on the strengths and weaknesses of the local market characteristics. So in doing so, I'm going to illustrate a few of these NICMAP tools, demonstrate some ways to analyze the data by rate tiers, and then get into a little bit deeper dive into the county level data and the neighborhood level data in order to kind of dig underneath the surface of the metro level data. So the first step is going to be to introduce you to the NICMAP Seniors Housing Rate Tiers Report, which was released just last week. And in response to really numerous client requests that we've been getting for different ways to break down the actual rates or the average market rate data, NICMAP recently developed a rate tiers approach to that market segmentation. So this analysis is really useful for investors and operators, analysts who want to benchmark their properties against properties that have a similar rate structure, and really providing more granularity across than the reported averages. So a little overview of the NICMAP Seniors Housing Rate Tiers Report. It does provide a historical time series of average market rates, average annual rate growth, occupancy, and inventory. And this does this for the majority independent living and the majority assisted living properties for the 31 markets, which we're calling the primary markets. And it does this by the metro market level by quartile. We're defining each uniquely for each metropolitan market as opposed to the national average, and there are 3 rate tiers For each metropolitan area that have been established based on the average market rate data, it's segmented into quartile. The first quartile being the top grouping, the middle two quartiles being the middle tier, and the bottom quartile being the bottom tier. So we are using a same-store methodology that's based on each metropolitan area's unique characteristics for each quartile within each tier. What's important about this is that it provides a number of capabilities and benefits. It provides a quantitative and objective rate tiers approach as opposed to kind of the subjective classifications that are seen across different commercial real estate property types, Class A, Class B, and Class C, and they tend to be a bit more subjective. What we're doing here is more objective and quantitative. Another benefit is that it compares property performance against similar benchmark classifications by rate quartiles and allows users to compare higher rate properties against their portfolios. And I think most importantly, it helps NIC deliver on its mission to attract smart capital into the marketplace by promoting ever levels of greater transparency in the sector. So I'm going to give you a quick look at kind of the aggregates for the primary markets with regard to occupancy metrics in the fourth quarter of 2018. The top chart is majority independent living occupancy by rate tier. The bottom is the majority assisted living occupancy by rate tier. Orienting you to the chart, the bottom tier is the color blue line, the middle tier is gray, and the top tier is red. And what we see here, where this data was derived, was from the all metros data file that comes out of the NIC map portal. So a little orientation to what we saw over the time series here. The occupancy rate for the bottom tier, majority IL properties in the 31 primary markets really outpaced the top and middle tiers for pretty much the whole time series with regard to independent living, both currently and historically. And that occupancy spread by rate tier was the greatest during and coming out of the Great Recession. Perhaps due to the greater affordability of the bottom tier properties, that may have allowed them to maintain greater levels of occupancy over the course of the time series. But more recently, as the market softened, the difference between the occupancy rates between the bottom and top tiers widened as much as 350 basis points in the second quarter of 2018 when independent living occupancy was at its 4-year low point. And currently in fourth quarter 2018, just to kind of wrap up what we're seeing with the patterns in occupancy with independent living, the bottom tier occupancy is currently about 180 basis points higher than the top tier. So orienting to the bottom chart there, majority assisted living, rate tier occupancy for majority AL property types really did follow a different pattern. And, coming out of the Great Recession, we know that there was much more development activity in the assisted living sector than there was in independent living. And interestingly, the rate tiers really kind of moved in lockstep with each other until we reached about the top of the market cycle in the fourth quarter of 2014 when we saw a lot of additional and increasingly amounts of new supply into the marketplace with assisted living. And that's when we start to see the rate tiers really start to diverge. As Beth had mentioned before, assisted living kind of bottomed out in the second quarter of 2018. And I think this is interesting because we really can see the rate tiers pulling apart and the spreads lengthening as assisted living occupancy really started to hit a downturn. With regard to AMR annual rate growth in the primary markets, it's looking at this, we see fewer obvious patterns than we saw for occupancy. And with this new data, this is pretty new data for us. As I mentioned, it was released just last week. We're digging into the analysis, but it's going to take a couple of months to get through a whole lot of the information. So it does raise a number of interesting questions that we'll be looking at. And, for one, we want to know how AMR rate growth relates to changes in inventory and occupancy by rate tier. This table while reviewing the historical time series for the 31 markets the primary markets is helpful from a broad perspective, it's pretty important to note that properties really should be looked at the metro level and the submarket level. And this table shows the upper and lower quartile breaks by breakpoints by market. And it's done also by majority property type. And I am also showing the dollar differences between the upper and lower breakpoints. So I'm not going to get in a huge amount of detail with this table. I mean, there's a lot of detail right there. You can look at it yourself. But majority AL upper and lower quartile breakpoints are wider for majority IL, both by and across the 31 primary markets. And New York, San Jose, San Francisco, and Boston are among the highest priced properties, metro markets, I should say, for both majority IL and AL property types. And several of these markets have a significant amount of variability in their pricing. So I'll let you look at that on your own. Okay. I want to orient you to what the standard rate tiers report looks like for each market. And in this case, we're showing New York, the majority IL for the fourth quarter of 18. In the upper right-hand side, I guess, we have occupancy rates by rate tier. The AMR, which is the average market rate, in this case in New York, up there in the upper left-hand side. The top tier has been rising at a much faster rate than the others, and it currently rests in the top tier at about $6,600, and that's for majority IL. In the bottom right-hand side, we have AMR annual rate growth, which is kind of interesting because there's a lot of variability by quarter. This is an interesting market, as Beth had mentioned before. There's fewer barriers to entry than other markets there, and basically, the AMR annual rate growth for a long period of time kind of tracked in the 5% range. And then we have also inventory growth on the bottom there as well. And I think what's interesting about New York is that there was a lot of much more growth in the middle tier than there was in the top tier. A little orientation. Just another look. This one's at Dallas. It's the current rate tiers report for the Dallas metro market, and we can see by comparing Dallas against what we just saw with New York that every market really does have its own story. And unlike New York, Dallas has seen more development in recent years, and clearly we can see the differences in inventory growth, the AMR, the annual rate growth patterns, and the occupancy patterns by rate tier. NICMAP's rate tiers report approach to seniors housing property database provides another way to segment the data. So there's increased granularity of the data, raises a number of interesting questions that will need to be explored, including, are markets with high top tier annual rate growth rates, are they dominated by large chains? Do markets with high variability in upper and lower quartile breakpoints suggest for greater need for analysts to take a look at the local markets? Also, what are the benefits and drawbacks of investing in metropolitan markets with wide or narrow variations in upper and lower tier pricing? And finally, does greater affordability of lower tier properties help insulate them from occupancy pressures in times of fluctuating demographic and economic change? So moving on, we're going to go even deeper into the data and do a county level dive. So in addition to segmenting a market by rate tiers, there are NICMAP reports that can be used to dig even deeper under the surface of the metro level data to help explain current market conditions and lend insight into local conditions. And so my goal with this is to demonstrate some of those levels of granularity that can be accessed. And as a result, I'm going to show you a county level analysis of the Denver metro area, and we'll do even deeper dive into some of the occupancy characteristics of one specific county. All right, to introduce you to the county level analysis, I'm going to start by showing the market fundamentals for the Denver metro area and really just offer a scenario, kind of a hypothetical storyline to get through the various data points that I'm going to show you. So for an example, and we get these questions a lot at Nick, calls in from different clients asking, trying to get a better understanding of what's going on in their, at the metro level and at the local market level. Say a developer and our operating partners are considering developing an IL, AL, or memory care property in, let's say, Lakewood, which is a suburb just to the west of the Denver city center. And their investor partners noticed that there's been a lot of inventory growth over the last couple of years in Denver. It's a very significant characteristic of that marketplace. And they cited reports that the all occupancy rate for seniors housing had fallen nearly 2 full percentage points since the fourth quarter of 17, and it's currently under the average for the 31 primary markets. Also, due to all that development, the balance between the all occupancy rate and the stabilized occupancy rates is currently 350 basis points compared to the national 31 markets, which was 210 basis points. And so now our developers, they know that market level data is a useful indicator of the broad conditions, but local conditions do vary. So what NICMAP tools can our developers use to kind of dig under the surface? I'm going to orient you to a few of the select counties that we're looking at in the Denver metro area. These 4 counties were chosen because they include all the properties currently under construction in the Denver area, which in the fourth quarter of 18 was a total of 12. So the trends report in the NICMAP client portal is a really great place to look at data that gets closer to the local level. And this table includes some select columns from the trends report. There are other metrics that are included in the trends report, but these are what I'm showing for illustrative purposes. And so comparing occupancy, annual absorption, annual inventory growth, construction, annual rent growth, a lot of these data points can help shed some light on what's going on in the Denver metro area and really explain some of the market level trends. All right. So going a little bit deeper into Jefferson County, depending on the questions that, and the goals of the analyst, the point of this chart is that there's many ways to visualize the data. This chart's derived from the trends report data that I just showed you and what we reviewed for Jefferson County, and it just really describes the supply and demand characteristics of which are the blue and orange bars against the rate of construction, which is the yellow line. In past charts, we've shown the line over the time series being occupancy. In this case, it's the rate of construction versus inventory. And what we see from this is that starting in kind of mid-2014, the rate of construction versus inventory really started to ramp up significantly, and it peaked and kind of topped out getting closer to 2017 at about 19%. During that time frame, or just actually a little bit further, between the middle of 16 and 17, inventory growth really expanded in Jefferson County as that construction that was in the pipeline really finished up and really came online there. But the story kind of flips over after that inventory hits the marketplace and the construction kind of levels off, and that really allowed absorption to climb. And what we're seeing right now is additional levels of high construction with a recent drop-off. But what this indicates is that there's potentially more occupancy challenges in the future once that pipeline makes its way through the system. Another way to look at the county level analysis is the analyst report. And this is a snapshot that I produced from multiple data points that you can get from the analyst report. Taking a look at profit status, there's a section for property age, stabilization status, and this is also for Jefferson County, which is our hypothetical site. So there's a couple of areas to focus on here that really add to our understanding of the story. And first I want to direct your attention to the total column, the yellow highlighted area, and a little bit more than halfway down the table to where the occupancy rows are located. And here we see that the difference between the all and the stabilized occupancy rate is 200 basis points. And we can see that there along the highlighted area halfway down the chart. So one might ask, why this difference? Well, by reviewing the data, it's split out by stabilization status, we can see that there were 34 stabilized properties and 1 non-stabilized property in this particular county. The stabilized properties had 91% occupancy, the unstabilized were 89%, and that's to 200 basis points. So essentially, that one unstabilized property is bringing down the occupancy rate in the county. So at NIC, we also get a lot of questions about the performance of different property types and at different ages, especially because we know that the seniors housing stock in this country has been aging for a long time, and really that age band is growing. Yeah?
Could you define stabilized for us?
Yes, I can. Stabilized occupancy is for properties that have been open for 2 years at minimum or have reached a 95% occupancy rate. The all occupancy rate is just that. It includes properties that are still in lease-up. So I want to direct your attention one more time to this table, kind of the middle part of the table, the property age and years. There's some interesting things that are going on that you can take a look at with regard to the age cuts. If you look in the middle there and kind of halfway down, or 3/4 of the way down with occupancy, we can see that the properties that are in the 10 to 17-year age band tend to have much stronger occupancy than those in the younger and the older age bands. And reasons for this can really vary. It could be that the properties in this middle age band have had time to establish good reputations, from longevity and stability of operations that occurs over time. It could be that these properties are not old enough to have experienced the need for repositionings or renovations. And it could be that some of these properties, just because they've been around longer, have established much greater consumer awareness and word of mouth. And finally, another reason could be that they've had much more time to develop their marketing programs and develop ways to maintain high resident satisfaction and really keep those folks in their properties. So to kind of wrap up this section of the presentation about the county level analysis, be really prudent for these developers not only to look at what's going on with the occupancy patterns that underlies the metropolitan level area down to kind of more this local level area that's around their site, but also to consider the competition implications with regard to some of these properties that may have been more established. So next I'm going to describe one more way to segment local data and gain some additional insight at the local level. And in fact, we're going to get down to the neighborhood and the property level with some interesting ways to use the data to inform portfolio and business strategies. We're going to do this by looking at walk scores. So last October, NICMAP included walk scores in the database, and NIC had really defined walkability as another helpful factor in analyzing markets to, mainly in response to a lot of developers and operators who have been gaining more and more interest in high-density areas, places to develop where, there's more urban areas than some of the suburban areas that historically seniors housing has been placed in. So WalkScore is a private company, and it's located in Seattle, Washington. Back in 2007, they launched their WalkScore methodology, and it's used by urban planners, public health researchers, various commercial real estate companies, and some of these you may have heard of, like Zillow and Redfin. WalkScore is really a measure of neighborhood walkability at the property level, at the address level. And it's a number between 0 and 100 that really describes the pedestrian friendliness of an area. It analyzes walking routes to neighborhood amenities by services, public parks, spaces, and all the points are given based on distance. And walk scores can be found in the NICMAP local property search pop-up windows, the property list, and the inventory file. And another cool feature with walk scores is that there's an advanced feature where a user can enter in kind of a minimum and maximum score and have those properties pop up on a map. So because today's and tomorrow's seniors are more active and more engaged in their communities, wellness activities are important than prior generations, and transportation is an issue. Mobility is an issue. It's also an issue for the senior living operators because not only do they need to find increasingly ways to fund transportation activities, they also need to develop staff and provide on-demand transportation. So being able to walk to stores and restaurants for the seniors is not only a benefit to the consumer but also to the operator. So why is walkability important? It's important for a number of reasons, and some of it will be citing research. There's a recent World Health Organization report that says simply living near a public park is good for cardiovascular and mental health, especially for older adults. Portland State University and the National Association of Realtors showed that 30% of baby boomers find a car-optional property very appealing. And then finally, a recent survey by A Place for Moms showed that between 80 and 90% of independent living and senior apartment consumers and 66% of assisted living consumers find that it's at least somewhat important to be living in proximity to daily goods and services. So additional research regarding walk scores and other commercial real estate asset classes really does suggest that there might be a link between higher property values and seniors housing, but really more research needs to be done with regard to seniors housing. So I'm going to show you, to kind of round this out, just a couple of examples. Yes? Yes? Mm-hmm. There is some research that does suggest that there are, at least with other types of commercial real estate, that there's a correlation between walk scores and higher property values. Now, that said, it hasn't been proven out through research in senior living, but hopefully more and more of that will come through as this gains more and more traction. So just a couple of quick examples to round this out. I assume I'm running out of time. This is an example of a walk score. The map is from the local property search. I've also overlaid a Google Map satellite view. And what this does show in this particular very urban area in Portland, Oregon, that we have a high level of residential density around the property. We have services and amenities located both to the north and south, and the neighborhood has a high level of walkability. The average walk score for the competitive set is 82, and we have a pretty high level of occupancy in this particular area, but occupancy can be due to a number of different factors, which I'll mention. The other example, just kind of on the flip side, this is a suburban example. We have Overland Park, Kansas, and as you can see, there's a lot of variability in just what we saw there between the two neighborhoods. So we had in Portland, we had a competitive set walkability score of 82, I believe. Here we have an average walk score of 58 for this particular competitive set. You can see from the satellite view that there's a very high level of concentration of services and amenities, but it's bisected. It bisects the property. Metcalf Avenue does this, a very highly traveled commuter business artery there. And so the differences that we could see between Portland and Overland Park, Kansas, are mainly in pedestrian friendliness. And while there's a lot of various positive attributes with regard to Overland Park, there are certainly other aspects that need to be thought of with regard to population density and the walkability of these properties. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth.
Yeah. So we're running late, so thank you for your patience here. But I did want to point out the last slide we have here. Marianne and Will, Nick staff in the back, that we have this new website called seniorcare.nic.org that we're really excited about. It's about collaboration in the seniors housing and care sector. It's the theme of this whole conference. So we welcome you to come and look at it. We're looking for you to contribute to it as well. And if you have any questions, Marianne, Will, can you stand up so people know who you are? These are the geniuses behind it, so check them out. So the next session, I think, happens in this room, and it's with me. So if you have any questions, we're a little late now for the end of this session, but we can take some questions if you want, or you can have a little break and then come back in. So do we have any questions for what you've heard about so far? Good expertise. If you have any questions, now's your chance to pick brains of 6 people or 7 people. Okay, and if not, then stay seated or come back in another 20 minutes. We'll see you then. Ooh.